Welcome to our webinar on getting beyond sentiment. Today's goal is to be able to talk about a little bit about sentiment analysis, but also to talk with some experts from industry and academia about things that we might do that are even more interesting than sentiment. So I'd like to introduce Chris Potts. Chris, you can wave. Chris is an associate professor at Stanford University in the linguistics department and does really interesting work that we'll get to see parts of. Vita Markman is an engineer at LinkedIn, and I first met her at this conference where she showed some really neat, very practical applications to simplify our lives in natural language processing. Vita, welcome, and Chris, welcome. So the first thing that I'd like to sort of begin with is just kind of the initial question of what is sentiment analysis really used for? What's it good for? So that as we move beyond sentiment, we sort of lay the groundwork of what is sentiment analysis in the first place and how is it useful. Chris, maybe you could take a swing at this. Sort of how is sentiment analysis used these days, and what do you see in terms of ways that it is useful and ways that it's not?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I'll leave, just for a second, I'll leave the industry part of it aside because maybe Vita wants to answer that. I would say in academia, when you're talking about things like computational semantics and systems for natural language understanding, sentiment is just a good, well, it's a good starting point because there's lots of labeled data, and you could think about it as having just a few dimensions. So if you're building a machine learning system or trying to define good features for doing a natural language processing task, it's a really good problem to start with. And then it's kind of arbitrarily complicated because from that simple starting point, you could add more emotional dimensions, you could do more complicated things with the linguistic representations that you're using, and build up into something that feels like a proper natural language understanding problem. So I think as a result of all that labeled data and all of the flexibility that comes with this problem, it's just become a good testing ground for new models of natural language understanding. And then there's another dimension to that, which is just that it's a good start into the complex world of sort of affective computing or social computing.
So Chris, you were just mentioning affective computing and the idea of going richer than sentiment. So the very first way that I actually became familiar with Chris's work was some work he was doing on TripAdvisor data and Amazon data and a bunch of different interesting data sources. And one of the things that he was looking at was the sort of curves of how people across rating schemes were using things like wow and quite and superb. Chris, I think you have some slides. Do you want to maybe put some of those up?
Here. So just a little bit of background. I've been interested in sentiment analysis in one way or another going back to my dissertation, which was in linguistic pragmatics, and was really about the weird way that things like swears and honorifics are integrated into the linguistic system, integrated into languages, the weird ways that they behave normally and also abnormally in the context of other things that are happening in terms of meaning expression. And that led naturally to corpus work because the usage conditions for things like swears and honorifics are really complicated. And we started using naturalistic labels like star ratings on product reviews to get a grip on how language like that was being used. The language that you see in this panel is not so expressive as a swear. There are lots of swears in my dissertation. This is a more mundane look, and you just can kind of see right away it's very intuitive. Along the x-axis, you have the 10 star ratings from IMDb movie reviews. And along the y-axis, you have something like the proportion of usage in reviews in each of those categories. And it's very intuitive, so you can see amazing is used almost exclusively in very positive reviews. Great is a little bit less biased in that direction. Good, when it's outside the scope of negation, is positive, but not too positive, and so forth. So this data was really great at giving us a rich quantitative picture at one dimension of meaning behind these words, which you might call the sort of evaluative sentiment behind them.
And the thing that I really liked about this was the ability for you to look at wow, for example, which is a thing that people used at both ends. So you would say both, wow, this is terrific, as well as way down at the bottom, wow, what a terrible movie or what a terrible product. And whereas something like quite would have this sort of upside down U shape where if you're using the word quite, you're really kind of giving a review, I think, of something that is balanced, right? So you're neither really negative nor are you really positive. Did I characterize that sort of as you would characterize it, Chris?
Yeah, that's great. And those words bring in, I mean, you might imagine many people believe you can build a model of sentiment anyway from valence and arousal. And what you're seeing in these pictures here is mainly a picture of valence being positively biased toward 10 stars or negatively biased toward 1 star. Those words like wow, they're really encoding something like the arousal level. So they end up U-shaped because they're used almost exclusively when people are very happy or very unhappy. And then attenuators like quite and but are used just when people have a complex sort of middle of the scale reaction. And bringing that back to swears, that was fun because many swears, which we think of as negative, in fact have lots of positive uses as kind of markers of solidarity and emotional engagement. So they sometimes surprisingly look kind of U-shaped.
So, you know, this work comes from a while ago. Can you say a little bit about where you feel like your trajectory has been, whether it's U-shaped or onward, upcline, sort of how you're thinking about these things differently, or sort of the directions that you've taken since this kind of work?
Yeah, absolutely. You can kind of see there, I would say there are 2 directions that I've gone, starting from this kind of lexical sentiment work. One of them you can see in the top part of the panel here, I think, which is all these trees. This comes from a collaborative project that was trying to get a grip using artificial neural networks on how sentiment information is expressed in words and phrases, and how, as you build up a complex meaning from the words, you get sentiment changing and evolving. And it's complicated, right? A very positive phrase, that would be something that was all blue in this picture, if it gets negated, could suddenly become negative. Or if you have 2 phrases, one positive, one negative, that has but in the middle, then depending on the order they come in, the overall phrase will be positive or negative. And those things really depend on understanding the fine-grained details of semantic composition, of how complex meanings are built. And sentiment is an important aspect of natural language meaning, and it brings with it all the complexities of that kind of compositional analysis. And I think that's really the end game. At some point, we have to move beyond words taken in isolation and think about how meanings are built in a complex way. And I would say the field has moved there as well. And the other direction is just to think about context. I have a bunch of other slides in here that are about the fact that you really can't think of sentiment analysis as something that's encoded strictly in sentences. You really need to think about who's talking to whom, about what their social relationship is like, what the topic of conversation is. All of that stuff is affecting sentiment expression. And so the other thing we've tried to do in a lot of these projects is think about not just the text, but the text in the context of a social network or in a sequence of text that builds up context, things like that.
I think we have Vita back, so I'm going to turn to her for a moment. Vita, yes, we can hear you okay.
Essentially, as I was saying, that in any business where the end is to basically have some kind of financial goal to make money, either from directly from customers or indirectly from membership base, through engagement, etc., understanding what customers or members feel about your brand, about your product, about your service are vital. Can you hear me?
That certainly makes sense, that sort of the importance of knowing what people are saying about you, for example, or the things that you care about. One of the things Chris was saying was sort of the complication of sentiment is that it doesn't just involve sort of one person, but obviously they have a kind of opinion about a thing. Part of what is important in that context is, you know, who they're talking to. And that's also something, it strikes me, that we're able to use as factors. So I think probably, Vita, you have some experience thinking about sort of richer inputs than just sort of positive, negative, neutral. Chris, I know that you have a slide prepared about sarcasm. I think that that's a thing that people often ask about, which is how could anyone, actually this is in industry a very typical question. Can you handle sarcasm? And if somebody says yes, you should say, oh, you're lying to me, so I'm not going to buy your product, right? That's the basic test in industry.
I'm going to give an answer that I actually am going to quote Richard Zocher, who had said, whenever someone asks, how do you handle sarcasm, he said, you have a training set. And the answer to that is that you will, whenever you have a really well-labeled training set of what sarcasm is, maybe, that would allow you to detect it better or worse. In general, while sarcasm of course exists, the prominence of it in people's feedback, in my experience at least, hasn't been that significant to say that, oh, we have a huge training set, we understand the variation of how people express sarcasm in the way that we understand the variation of how people express a generally positive, negative, neutral, or like extreme emotional distress type of response. So that's a kind of a bit of a flippant answer, but yes, sarcasm is very interesting. At the same time, the prevalence of it isn't enough to.
Yeah, I think that's a nice point that even if you're getting it wrong or you're at chance, the truth is that in most circumstances, it's a relatively small amount of your data. So you're never going to have a perfect model. So getting pretty close and is often good. Chris, do you want to walk us through this slide of how you might approach something like sarcasm, and also tell us a little bit about how this might generalize to things outside of sarcasm?
Sure, I can build on the point that Vita just made. So she said, I guess, show me the data. That's what Richard Socher said. Show me the data and we'll see what we can do in terms of sarcasm detection. And I guess the point of this slide would be that that data set that you would need could not be a data set of text in isolation, right? It's just not a fact about this text I have here, which says, yeah, great idea, that it is sarcastic or not, right? That same phrase there with the same syntax could be used sarcastically or not. That's inherent to the problem of non-literal language use. It depends on context. So if somebody just gave you a list of texts, some labeled sarcastic and some not, I think you would not be able to make progress on this problem. And so the point of this slide is just, if you have some contextual information, here I've done it in a kind of exaggerated way, so if you know that this was written by someone who calls himself Sarcasm Dog, and you know a bunch of other stuff about how this user interacts in the context of where this comment was made, then you might be able to get a grip on whether it's sarcastic or not. And so that engages deeply with the point I was making before, that emotional expression, it's really not, it's not a fact about text, it's a fact about people using language, and you have to bring the people in if you're going to do a good job on this problem.
So, this kind of gets us to this, this sort of practical aspect of, you just have to have the data in order to be able to even get started. One of the things I'd like to go back to is this very practical consideration that first introduced me to Vita's work at LinkedIn, where she was looking at not just words, as we've kind of been talking about words, and Chris has been talking about how you need to be more compositional and context-rich in understanding what's going on in sentiment or any other sort of affective dimension or even beyond affect. And one of the things that Vita was looking at was, how can I find the topics that people are talking about, the important and significant topics worth tracking. And so, Vita, I was wondering if you could talk us through, I think, these slides that are on screen now.
So I'm going to first contextualize this a little bit. Whenever often people get, like, for a company or a product, they get tweets or Facebook posts about that product. That's a very popular thing to do these days in many different industries. So what we would like to do is we would like to get a better sense of what kinds of topics people mention when they mention us, and then mention it positively or negatively. So, for instance, when people talk about jobs in the context of LinkedIn, what kinds of topics they mention, and what is a topic? A topic, ideally, is a meaningful phrase. So good morning is not really a topic. It's not very interesting. But something like talent solutions or job recommendations is an interesting topic that we want to understand, are people happy or unhappy with, given our given LinkedIn's work within that domain. Similarly, something that's a fragment like jobs and is not a topic, but jobs and opportunities is a topic. So in order to extract topics, I use a very simple method, very industry useful, because it's fast and doesn't really require anything. Basically, you take your corpus of interest, which in this case is a collection of tweets and Facebook posts on a particular very broad category like job, and then you take a completely different set of text, in this case some articles, and you extract the most top frequent unigrams from that other text, and then basically apply a very basic rule that says if you take an n-gram that from your corpus and it either begins or ends in that very frequent word, then this is not a topic. So things like the book or on LinkedIn or in jobs are not topics. In contrast, things like jobs on LinkedIn, career opportunity, or business development is a topic. And so the phrasal anagrams that you are able to extract this way are then going to be interesting topics of which you can look more deeply and try to understand what is the general opinion of things like career opportunity, talent solutions.
One of the things that I love about this is that it's just so practical and really straightforward to implement. So I'll just make a plug for Mark Davies at Brigham Young has a really beautiful site with lots of different corpora that are easy to grab word frequency information from. And so that's certainly one of the favorite ones that I have. Let me take a moment before I turn to Chris to see if he has any favorite corpora to talk about, to just make sure that everybody who's signed in and listening, if you would like to raise your hand and ask a question, please do feel free to do that. And we will make sure that we'll answer there. You just go to the Q&A box that you should see on your screen and type in a question, and we will make sure that it can get answered. So Chris, are there any hot corpora that you think we should have our attention drawn to, whether it's for the interesting annotations possible or just for the practical use of getting frequencies and other sort of basics down?
I don't know whether I have a specific corpus that I want to plug. People could go to my website. We've released a lot of annotated data, some of it related to sentiment and some of it related to just doing semantic tasks in general. And we're going to be releasing another big one very soon related to textual entailment. So let me just dodge the question about my favorite corpora and say instead that what I really like to do if I have a new collection of data is do some kind of visualization of the latent associations, the distributional associations in that corpus. I have a few pictures. Let me see. Oh, my slides are gone. But what I like to do is build distributional word vectors, so capturing the co-occurrence associations between words in the corpus, maybe do some massaging to those vectors to get them to bring out the important aspects of their relationships, and then visualize them. I typically use an algorithm called TSNE, which stands for T-distributed stochastic neighbor embedding. I have an example here. Let me see if I can get it out.
So everyone can read it.
No, luckily you don't, at this level, you don't need to be able to read it. What it's done is take very high dimensional representations of the meanings of the words in this corpus and embed them in 2 dimensions so that you can see them. And what you get a picture of right away is that there are these areas, very tight areas of local coherence kind of distributed around in this space. And when you go in, you'll see that they relate to specific emotional topics or specific factual things in the corpus. It's really quite varied. And what that gives you is a chance to find out what latent associations are in your data that you might not have anticipated. So it's like the opposite end of the spectrum of using a canned sentiment lexicon or something where you presuppose that you know all the dimensions of variation. Here, they're just open to you. And you can often learn a lot about surprising aspects of sentiment in the corpus, associations you might have overlooked. And you might just find out in general what's happening in the data at a very high level. And it can also inform then downstream analyses that you do. They're very easy to create and typically very illuminating.
Yeah, this is one of the things that we certainly do, we use topic modeling for, is to explore the space of, well, what's in this collection of data? Because sometimes we want to find things that are not really there. For example, if you end up with certain collections of news articles can end up being really very neutral in terms of sentiment, but that doesn't mean that they're useless. Of course, there's lots of really interesting things going on in them. So I'm wondering if maybe we sort of shift the conversation a little bit more to the sort of things that are kind of beyond sentiment, that either maybe are cousins to it or maybe a little bit orthogonal to that. So some of the topics that I think people have expressed interest in include expertise, loyalty or trust, emotions in general, which is clearly related to sentiment, and politeness. And I'm wondering if we could talk a little bit about those. Maybe Chris, you want to begin, and then Vita can add in comments that she has from her experience.
Sure, yeah, just quickly, because this is a use of one of those visualizations. So right below, I think you can see it here. This is a figure from Jan Overgore's Stanford MA thesis. Jan now works at Airbnb, and he's coming back to Stanford as a graduate student soon. And he was interested in, he had a big data set from couch surfing. And he was interested in what textual indicators there are for whether or not certain kinds of requests on the site are going to be successful. And so this is a little fragment of whether or not somebody who's asking for a couch to sleep on, the things they do in their text, whether they correlate with getting the request met or not. And it's kind of surprising. You might not have anticipated this. The positive words, they're over in that left panel, are things about house and home, basically, and about the couch surfing community itself, like volunteering. Those are the things that are met with a positive response for a request. On the other hand, if you mention things that you want to do in the town, parties, bars, museums, swimming, things like that, which kind of show that you're not engaged with the host, then you're less likely to have your request met. So this is a kind of sentiment problem, but obviously much more social. You would think it would just correlate with some stuff about sentiment. And then the high dimensional visualization really shows you some surprising stuff about what kind of requests work and what don't that you might not have anticipated before. And then you can go off and build models on that basis.
Yeah, I really like the way this basically shows that, well, when you're talking about yourself, and especially it looks like family terms, that's very compelling to people. And I think it's really interesting that sort of, especially in couch surfing, this makes sense, where it is meant to be where a lot of people who host couch surfers want that experience of getting to know them. So the idea that you're going to be out of the house all the time doing your own thing, if you're in museums, you're too boring. If you're parties, you're going to come home drunk. I think that's a really interesting thing that people already are sort of picking up on that in terms of their actual real life behavior. I think that's also a nice point where this means that you often have data sets in your organization that really are essentially annotated, right? In this case, you're really exploring the fact that, well, now we can sort of predict what's motivating people to say, yes, I'm going to take a couch surfer on, or no, I'm not going to take this couch surfer on, which means that you can build these predictive models, which are presumably a lot more useful to you than just knowing, yeah, this person seems to be talking about like hating things, or this person seems to be loving things, which probably in this data set wouldn't really give you much of interest. I think that's a really nice demonstration there of those themes. Vita, do you want to jump in with anything right here?
So not necessarily related to couch surfing, but in general, I just want to make one comment. I have never seen museum in a negative context before. This is a kind of interesting thing that, again, reinforces how domain-specific and how context and people-specific the sentiment work can be in a remarkable way. I mean, I never ever thought that museum could ever be making parties, loud drinking. Anyways, but my sort of close work was mostly with so trying to relate sentiment to emotion, such as anger or frustration, which is when you try to analyze customer catalogs or email for customer support. Usually they're never super positive. There's usually some negativity, but the question is what is really negative versus what is attribute to general discontent versus something that is very, very important for customer agents to take immediate action on. So that is the kind of relationship that I'd explored in more depth than necessarily looking at these different notions of politeness or how do people express feelings towards a community as Chris was saying.
I think one of the things that Vita just sort of brought us to was really these customer support issues, and that's a really important area, right? In the acoustic study of emotion, when people sort of analyze people calling into call centers and look at that, one of the things they realized is that they had done this whole enormous sort of lots of research projects on how people express joy and hatred in their speech. But of course, once you get to real life data like customer support, as Vita is saying, people aren't really calling in to be joyful. And so you get this whole other part of the emotional spectrum that's sort of relevant there. And in general, right, like I think, Vita, one of the things you're probably thinking about there is that you want to be able to maybe prioritize people who are really angry differently than people who are sort of not really angry. Has that mattered to you, sort of a degree of negative emotion or the type of negative emotion?
Yeah, absolutely. Especially in my previous work that mostly dealt with analyzing customer support chat logs. But even right now, one of the things that is very tricky is oftentimes, what is a trending issue that people complain about or people bring up? Sometimes something very, very emotionally charged is not trending at all. It's something very rare. And that is a trick to try to discover those topics or those words even that are incredibly rare. And so with any kind of frequency threshold, you level up, but they are really, really important because all it takes sometimes is like one very upset individual to really damage the brand. That's very important to keep in mind to try to discover what is the nature of the language expressions to counteract that in time.
Yeah. Chris, do you want to, one of the things that you sort of touched on earlier that we've mentioned is that sort of, I mean, in my world, I think of it as a stance triangle or kind of positioning, right? This idea of what we've been touching on throughout, which is that it's not just what you're saying, it's about something and it's to someone. I think that you have a graph about that. Do you want to sort of talk through that a little bit? Can we make that big? Yeah, so, okay, so it's a pretty set of triangles with colors. What should we take away from this?
All right, yeah, so this is from a paper we did recently studying, as I was saying before, person-to-person evaluations in the context of social networks. And so what we did is try to synthesize both those kinds of information. We had labels for some of the texts, and we had labels, as you can see on these triangles, for people's social relationships, and we synthesized that information. And I just want to say that this diagram here is meant to bring out something like sarcasm, right? So you're one crazy mofo, that could be negative or positive depending on the context. Now, if you know the social link between those people is positive, you can get one read on it. If you know the social connection between them is negative, you could get another read on it. And that's important not just for sarcasm, but you have all these things like lots of markers of solidarity, like, oh, you're terrible, right? I could say that playfully to you if we're friends. If you know we're friends, then you'll get a proper read on what I was trying to convey to you there. If we're political enemies, though, then you'll get a very different read on the text. And so that was cool because, again, it's situated kind of context-dependent sentiment analysis. And it was also possible for us to take advantage of, like where we had good network data, we didn't have to rely so much on the text to get good predictions, and the reverse. So that's what these triangles are all about. The model that's behind this paper synthesizes our assumptions about those triangles and the pluses and minuses with what we can do in terms of textual sentiment analysis.
So one of the things we've kind of been talking about is, okay, so there are lots of off-the-shelf sentiment models. One thing that I guess I should just sort of say is that that's going to be limited when you're working in the wrong domain, right? So if you've trained on IMDb reviews and you're trying to see how people are talking about smartphones, you'll get terrible and wonderful, right? But you'll have all sorts of problems. So there's a kind of domain specificity that we've been talking about. The other thing is the idea of that there's a lot of data that especially companies and other large organizations have that is essentially already sort of ready for analysis, right? So in many cases, the customer service questions already are categorized, so you can use that. In the case of couch surfing, Chris, you gave that example of, well, we know, they know at least who was said yes to and who was said no to, so you can predict that. I'm curious about, for those things when you have a data set and you've done some exploration and you want to do some new dimension that you don't have sort of a ground truth for, how do you, Chris, how do you approach that situation?
Well, I guess maybe you could say a bit more about what you mean. I mean, I suppose if you have an insight about your data, in most contexts, you could write a feature extraction function that would try to encapsulate your insight about the data, and then you might hope that it correlates with whatever you're trying to do. Is that the kind of thing you have in mind?
I think that's important. I actually was going more for, I know that that you've done work with crowds, right? Whether they're sort of really big, massive online crowds or maybe more controlled undergraduate crowds. Could you say a little bit about sort of using that, how that works, whether it works for novel models that are sort of beyond sentiment?
Well, you guys are really the experts on crowdsourcing, so I won't say much. I guess I'll just say that our philosophy about that is that we treat them like psycholinguistic experiments. We try to set up these crowdsourcing tasks very carefully and think of them as human subjects work. And when we do it right, it seems like we get good worker engagement. It seems like the tasks are basically not too arduous for people to do. And then we get great labels. Some of the most exciting things that I've done research-wise in my career have been built on all the insights of people doing crowdsourced annotations for us. So that's been really successful, and I'm very encouraging about people doing crowdsourcing, as long as you remember that there are people out there and that you really want to treat them like people who are helping you out.
Yeah, I think that's a really nice insight, the idea that part of what we're trying to do is use machines to help people understand people, right? And so that means that people are a fundamental part of every step of the way. Even when there's that machine part, learning, as machine learning works, you've got people on every side of it. Vita, I think you've worked some on crowdsourcing as well. Do you want to say anything about best practices of sort of making that work?
The key is to, of course, treat people as people, number one, but also be mindful of the fact that the questions you're setting up are very nuanced, and to know exactly what kinds of range of answers you're expecting. And instead of saying, is this good or bad, really explain for these subjective tasks what it means to be good in the context of what you're investigating. Otherwise, the data is likely very, very noisy, and agreements might be either near random or not reliable. You need to make sure that what you're eliciting, you know exactly how to define what good is. When you say, is this sentence, especially in evaluating short data like sentential sentiment within a sentence, to say, is this expressing positive or negative opinion on something, you have to give examples of, this is what I'm looking for when I say positive, this is what I'm looking for when I mean negative. And make sure that you internally, your team who's doing this task to crowdsource it out, can first agree themselves on what it is. Then get really as close as to 100% agreement among each other, and then only outsource it to crowds that directly give input and feedback to. And then you can get really good data. But you have to be experimental, just like experiment, incredibly psycholinguistic experiment. You have to control people's attention span or their responses and all these things that go into a subject study. It's an experiment. Otherwise, it will be garbage in, garbage out.
We certainly around here deeply believe in that idea that you want to make sure that you're defining tasks that are doable. One of the things we often ask our clients to do is sort of a round of annotation themselves, and then we can sort of use inter-annotator agreement and other statistics to make sure that the categories make sense, that sort of the experts on what they want actually agree with each other. That helps in the sort of guideline phase so that other people can be brought in to sort of magnify and scale those sort of initial judgments to something that's on the order of something that you can actually put in front of machine learning. Chris, I think you scrolled up to some deep problems. Do you want to take us home in these last minutes with some deep problems?
Oh, I only did it because it picked up so nicely on the point Vita made. Like, these are sentences, I think it's totally unclear for some of them whether and what label you would give. Like, one, there was an earthquake in LA. that's bad news, but if you're asking people to do annotations, do you want them to label that as negative, or is that just a thing that happened in the world? And then two would amplify that. So if you just ask someone whether that's good or bad news without that parenthetical there, again, I think they would just be flummoxed because it's not clear whether that's good or bad news for you. And then it gets down to things like reported speech. They said it would be great. Again, it has some positive words in it, but maybe the reported source is not trustworthy. And then, all the way down to 6, which I mentioned, which is just impossible to get a read on without a lot of context. So I would just scroll to them because I thought these are exactly the kind of examples that lead to bad crowdsourced annotations. If you just say, hey, label this data for us, and you don't tell people what your goals are, you'll get a real mess.
Or even things like label data that is emotionally charged. I mean, what is it? This is a real example. Somebody said they were trying to get some experiments with emotionally charged speech. I said, do you know what that is? And said, give me an answer. If you don't know what it is, then nobody can answer this question for you. So and these are really hard tasks for people to do, to define what emotionally charged means. Does it mean like the F word, or what does it really mean? What are the key examples in distinguishing features of emotionally charged?
One of the previous projects that we worked on was building an obscenity, obscenity is not quite right, an objectionable material filter that sort of automatically sort of classified things. But when you sort of include taboo words, clearly go in that direction, but people are very varied in what they actually what their tolerance is for. We can all imagine some very obscene things that, yes, everyone will agree, yep, that's objectionable. But there are all sorts of words, like taboo words, that half of the people will say, that's fine, and half the people will say, no, that's a bad word, so it should be classified over here. So that importance of defining what the task is in a way that is repeatable, that's really, I think when you guys are talking about the experimental design, that's where it's really important to have, so that I think those processes and sort of ways of asking these questions so that you can get to those meaningful results. Otherwise, as Vita, you were saying, garbage in, garbage out, right? So I think we have hit the end of our time. I want to thank Chris and Vita for joining us. Really appreciate your time. And I want to thank the people who have been sort of asking questions and thinking about these things and listening to us for their participation. This will be up so that you'll be able to send other people to it so they can watch it. And we're excited to also be putting more blog posts together. And you should definitely check out Vita's LinkedIn profile, and you should go to Chris's webpage at Stanford and check out all the really great materials that he has available. Any final words, Chris and Vita?
No, just keep studying the field and expanding the horizons of what is sentiment and what is beyond, as long as you make sure to control for your experiment and make sure that your design is exactly what you want.
Chris, any last words from you?
No, thanks everyone. I really enjoyed this.
All right. Bye, everyone.